forgive me because we're old friends. 40 years ago, you and I were sitting late one evening and you were discussing Adam Smith.
And now with the advent of AI, how do you think AI could help in that?
International trade is good for the world. I guess you saved the hardest one for last, didn't you? Before we end, I would like to stick in one little snippet. Appreciate that AI works wonders. Oh my goodness.
There is something called robust quality management for drug manufacturing. What does it mean in a day-to-day practice? Hi, everybody. I am Javed Iqbal. I am actually a professor, and also later on I worked for Dr. Reddy's, and currently I'm an advisor to Scimplify. I have the pleasure of introducing my old friend, Professor Fortunak, who was previously a pharmaceutical industry where he contributed a great deal to FDA approvals of almost 40 new drugs and generic products with a total sales of 200 billions. And his research includes green novel technologies to reduce cost and promote global access to medicines. Professor Fortunak also works with organizing including USA, WHO, UNAIDS, USP, WHO, and the Global Fund. These efforts reduced the cost of hepatitis C treatment by over 3 billion in 2016 to 20. He has been awarded, which includes American Chemical Society Heroes of Chemistry and a US FDA Honor Award for Excellence and Innovation. Professor Fortunak is also the Chief Scientific Officer at Innovation Health Services in Baltimore, Maryland. I have the pleasure of, Professor, inviting you for this podcast. And let me begin by sort of asking you a few questions which are kind of generic in nature, but I would like to kind of put before you some of those questions before we kind of take it into more detailed discussions. My first question, of course, is related to there is a rise in global demand for treating non-communicable diseases. And what role can pharmaceutical and chemical R&D play in developing new treatments or even prevention of strategies? Can you dwell upon this, please?
Sure. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And thank you for the chance to have this sort of a discussion. And so what we don't appreciate is first of all, the mortality of the rest of the world. So we respectively are sitting here today. I'm in Washington, D.C., you're in India, and we're in countries that are pretty well supplied with drugs. For the rest of the world, when I visit Nigeria is a middle-income country, lower middle income, but life expectancy there is 56 years. And that's an incredibly low life expectancy. It's one of the lowest in the world out of the 200 plus countries that are recognized by the World Health Organization. And what people die from is once we've begun addressing the acute need for medicines for anti-infectives, for antiviral diseases, for vaccines and the like, people die largely from cardiovascular disease or cardiometabolic diseases, which also includes, for instance, diabetes. And in addition to this, oncology needs, cancer. So the rest of the world has really scarce access to those sorts of medicines. And as the United Nations is moving this week as we speak, the UN General Assembly is making deliberations and coming up with recommendations for how countries can access medicines for these types of diseases in a broad-based effort to increase life expectancy. But another thing is that this actually gets into something that I think is more core to what we'd like to understand between us, where you can help me and I can parrot back some of the needs of the U.S. industry, is that the U.S. industry is very broadly based upon supplies coming in from the outside. And we're having this discussion in late 2025 in a period where the global pharma industry is in a greater flux than it has been for many, many years. So to sort of set a framework for all of this, in the U.S., healthcare absorbs about U.S. $4.5 trillion a year, around 15% or so of our gross domestic product. Now, the portion of that is broadly accessible from the Indian industry in terms of supply and demand is probably about a third of that. And that includes personal protective equipment, vaccines, biologics, small molecule drugs, and diagnostics. Well, in addition to that, however, the cutting this down into a smaller, more manageable piece to think about, U.S. drug spending was $806 billion last year. And it's increasing at a rate of about 11% per year. There's another $180 billion a year in spend that goes to over-the-counter medicines, which in the US, that's things like cough and cold remedies, allergies and allergic rhinitis, sleep aids, and simple analgesics such as ibuprofen and paracetamol, that of course we call acetaminophen here. Well, out of all of this, right, so this is not so far off from being $1 trillion a year. In the prescription drug area, 91% of those prescriptions are written for generic drugs, so drugs that are not covered by patent and are largely supplied from the outside. And again, most of that supply essentially comes from Indian generic companies. The top 16 generic companies in the United States all have their own captive manufacturing for active pharmaceutical ingredients, and supplying that huge market is a really important aspect of the U.S. healthcare market. But in addition to this, there are key starting materials, there are the building blocks for raw materials, and even beyond that, as we go outside of healthcare, there's a huge market that's evolving for U.S. supply of things such as for the electronics industries and for crop protection and other agricultural needs.
Well, very nicely put. And now, next, I would like to talk about how can pharmaceutical companies ensure the stability of their supply chains? Excuse me, especially given the recent disruption. I mean, you know that there's a lot of perception globally about the supply chain. What are your views on that?
Oh, my dear friend. So you can see that I've got white hair. I joined the pharmaceutical industry in 1983, and essentially I've been working, most of my efforts have been devoted to the pharmaceutical industry or crop protection ever since that time. I've worked in drug discovery, drug development. I've worked even in generic drug manufacturing. Now, what happened with COVID is that we all began to appreciate the downside of something that had been going on for 40 years. It essentially goes back to something called the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 in the United States. Maybe we can discuss that a little bit more later, but what has been happening is that there has been a steady movement. Right. And we always think of this as hypothetically, this is a very good thing. The movement of goods and services goes from places where their production is most efficient to places where the demand is highest. And there's a balance of supply and demand, and it's good for everyone. Well, what this has caused is the slow movement of manufacturing of pharmaceuticals out of the United States to India and then to China. And India and China have prioritized and become the world powerhouses at turning out the raw materials and the key starting materials, and particularly in the case of India, the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients for making drugs. And so that's where we are today. But what COVID made us appreciate, and what the strong trends towards the erosion of multilateralism in international relations has made us appreciate that countries are vulnerable if they have these very complex supply chains that meet the demand for global pharmaceuticals.
Right. Very nicely put. India is obviously a big supplier of APIs and intermediates, but India still suffers from working in an innovation deficient environment. And related to this, I want to ask you a question which is very generic in nature. Why is R&D essential in chemical industry, and how does it fuel growth across sectors like pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and material science? So it's a very generic question, but in India it becomes because a lot of Indian companies do not pay much attention to R&D. I would like to have your views on that.
That's a very interesting thing in the sense that I strongly get the feeling that the Indian industry has a tendency of downplaying its own innovative contributions, but at the same time, casting it within a different aspect. The historical lack of participation of the Indian industry in the fundamentals of drug discovery have caused it to place less emphasis. So if I think back, look, I have some wonderful friends who are global heroes in the pharmaceutical industry who are Indian. And they've, for instance, our friend Yusuf Hamid, who stood up at the G8 conference in 2004 and said, I can assure the quality of HIV drugs. I've been approved by the US FDA, and I can supply treatment for $1 a day. It was a giant bombshell, and it's saved tens of millions of lives since 2004. Now, the part of this that is of interest to us is that India, in beginning its pharmaceutical industry, discovery companies already existed globally. The emphasis was on making available drugs that already existed. And it's now now, after such a huge success and rising to a preeminence, where frankly, India probably supplies more of the drugs for the entire world than any other country, that India is finally realizing, oh, wait a minute, I am entirely capable of going through the sophisticated machinations that come together to do real fundamental drug discovery. Now, sadly, publicly, we're seeing that more associated with China today than with India for various reasons. They're outside the scope of what we'll talk about today. But frankly, India is very capable of doing this. And it is actually really wonderful and interesting to see this beginning.
Well, no, in continuation with the same theme as R&D, I have another question. As R&D moves from discovery to scale up, what are the primary challenges faced in terms of manufacturing, regulatory approvals, and market readiness? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, goodness. Let me start my answer with this in framing it a little bit. I'm talking about an ANDA, so an abbreviated new drug application. Well, India, right, you are the powerhouse in supplying medicines for the rest of the world, and the global regulatory framework relies upon each country having its own, but really quite similar mechanisms for the review and approval to market drugs. The ANDA application, an abbreviated new drug application, means that a drug already existed, it was marketed by someone else, but what a generic company, so a multi-source company, they are proclaiming and proving with their regulatory submission, what we've done is we've assured the quality of what we're manufacturing, and we have assured its equivalent, its similarity to the originator product by doing a bioequivalence trial, no matter what shape that takes. So if you're operating under good manufacturing practice, if you validated your manufacturing process, and if you're filing that ANDA, you don't need to redo clinical trials to prove safety and efficacy. That's why this is an abbreviated application. This is where India has a niche in which they are absolutely fantastic. And we should also pay attention to the fact that India has a burgeoning business in supplying key starting materials and APIs, particularly in the late stage of life cycle, to big originator pharmaceutical companies as well to bring down their cost of goods. You've always been really eminent in cost of goods.
Now, next question, which is related to this, is what are the biggest challenges researchers are facing today in terms of funding, technology adoption, and collaboration? I mean, I'm talking mostly in context of India, and of course, in America, it's perhaps different. But what do you think generally, globally, the challenges that researchers are facing in terms of funding, technology adoption, and collaboration? What are your views on that?
This is such an area that is in such a degree of flux. So if I can go, last year, for instance, a Nobel Prize was awarded for artificial intelligence in protein folding. And this is now broadly available to much of the world. This is an area where I think the Nobel Prize was richly deserved by the investigators who were awarded. But artificial intelligence in here is teaching us things that it's difficult for drug discovery to come to grips with. That's when we invent new medicines, we're looking for protein targets to bind with and to either activate or deactivate in the human body or in animals or whatever the subject is.
Yeah.
But we have not appreciated that it's a fluid type of a thing. Proteins are not static. We need to understand what happens. Well, that's part of the answer that I'd like to give you. But another part is that drug discovery has become extremely fragmented. Big pharmaceutical companies are pursuing the grand visions. I would say that the recent approval, say, of lenacapavir as an HIV-1 capsid inhibitor is an extremely good example of that. Attacking a mechanism of action that is unique and not immediately obvious to a virus and only that virus, and coming up with something that is a once every 6 months injectable treatment to prevent HIV and to mitigate viral load in virally challenged patients who have a lot of mutations. But there's an awful lot of other drug discovery that's going on for orphan indications and for rare diseases. To underlie all of that, the world is pretty satisfied in a lot of different areas. Increasingly, the places that we have for innovation in treating diseases like hypertension, high cholesterol, atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular disease, we're pretty satisfied. And there's a short list of medicines that can pretty well control those drugs. That that's
Yes.
where drug discovery has less of an opportunity because the challenges are so high and the demand can be satisfied if people have access. But
Correct.
access is
Absolutely.
still a problem, and new discovery is increasingly dependent upon things like understanding proteins and mechanisms of action and ever more sophisticated assays. The
Yeah.
assays are really difficult to set up, and India is critical for many discovery companies, as is China, because India has set up a system of research labs where they can provide those assays. Those assays are expensive to set up and maintain.
In continuation of what you're talking about, drug discovery, I now want to bring in the very topical thing, the artificial intelligence, and how AI is transforming drug discovery and development, and what are the key areas where AI is providing breakthroughs. I mean, this AI has
Okay.
become kind of, what do you think about it?
Sure. Yeah, we all love this word of AI. And of course, I'm going to throw in the typical caveat that we need to make sure that a human being looks over the shoulder of AI because sometimes AI can give you crazy answers to questions where it's just flat out wrong. But in all of the cases that we're speaking about, it can become a very valuable adjunct. But we really do need AI for things such as looking at the business of protein targets, looking at some of the less obvious targets like protein degradation. How can we
Hmm.
deactivate problems in the human body to attack human diseases? But even more so than this, looking at toxicogenomics and metabolomics, right? So that there are huge amounts of data that require multiple different disciplines looking at them and bringing it all together to, if you look at your protein folding, you come up with a dozen different new structures that are good drug candidates. How do I bring that down to one or two that I want to kill those molecules before I get into human beings if they're going to fail? And AI can help us weed out those weaklings that we can expect to be toxic or we can expect to have inadequate pharmacokinetics so that we can pick the most likely drug targets.
Let's talk about prescription drugs and patented drugs. The most prescription being generic but branded products driving most spending. How should industry and policymakers balance innovation, incentives with patient access? This is a very important, in fact, consideration today. Especially in America, also in the
Oh
US.
my goodness. This is an incredibly important area and frankly it's an area where the global landscape is significantly different. In the United States, we pay the highest prices for drugs of any country in the world, and you might consider that we have the most incentives for innovation and new drug discovery as well, but we don't get the best outcomes. We tend to have later access to generic medicines than high-income countries such as Japan and the European Union, and also versus countries such as India and China. That all brings into play questions about intellectual property and how generic drugs reach the market. Well, the United States ranks about number 48 in terms of life expectancy. But at the same time, we have, I'll go back again to something that I referred to, something called the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, because that brings us back into the framework of how all this works. So we begin with one key aspect. It's the abbreviated new drug discovery, right? So a generic company knows how they can legally get into the market. But there are other aspects of this. Now, that act from 1984 has been evolved and updated. And so, for instance, there's a safe harbor so that people who are doing research and development, but they're not selling a drug, they can do that R&D before a drug is sold in the United States. There is something else that there are some incentives further for the generics industry to enter the market and provide cost competition. Because frankly, innovator companies charge very high prices as long as they have a monopoly. Well,
Absolutely.
there's a crazy thing, called there's 180-day exclusivity for the first generic companies into the market in the United States, and that's very important for recouping their investment cost. R&D is really necessary for generic companies because they need to discover things that the originator companies don't make available. They need to have their own process, and frankly, with the large number of chemists, innovator companies practice just-in-time science for chemistry and manufacturing and controls. Indian companies live based on price competition. They practice coming up with the best processes for generic manufacturing so they can reduce cost, and with innovative formulations so they can compete based on a differentiation in convenience and other aspects, right? So this 180-day exclusivity really is important in repaying that cost of that innovation that goes into Indian generics. Now, the US, the originator companies got something back called the Patent Term Restoration and Extension Act. For instance, if an existing drug is approved for a new treatment, then they get 3 years of exclusivity. If an existing drug is approved for the treatment of children, pediatric extensions, that's another 6 months of exclusivity. But the US also incentivized something that all of us hate called patent litigation.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of those. Yeah.
As originator companies, if they're selling $5 or $10 billion a year of a drug, they want to protect that franchise as long as possible, and they will file multiple patents, many patents in some cases, in order to extend the period of exclusivity. So
you're talking about paragraph 4 challenges, right?
Yeah, paragraph 4 challenges. So as you've referred to, yes, so an Indian company or any generic company, they need to get their drug pre-approved by the US FDA. So this includes the GMP, the validation, the bioequivalence. But then they need to file a notice with the originator company that holds the monopoly, and a paragraph 4 filing, a certification says, well, one of two things exists. I'm either not infringing any of your patents, or if I'm infringing them, they're invalid for some reason, and I'm challenging their validity. That introduces something that's very important called a 30-month stay. It's often called the patent dance, where generic companies and originators engage in litigation to figure out which patents truly do apply and hold for the introduction of generic competitors.
Yes, absolutely. Now, in continuation of that, just to take up what you said, very important, and I could agree more with you. But why do some new or updated medicines get a period of exclusivity, and how does that affect the lower cost versions when they arrive?
I'm going to use an example for this one, all right? Let's think about Keytruda. Keytruda, a great drug. It's a PD-1, PDL1 ligands binder, and what it does is it silences the signals in cancer cells that keep them alive, and it allows the human body and the immune system to go in and kill those cancer cells as it would normally.
Right.
Great drug. Now, it's an expensive drug. In the United States, it costs somewhere above about $200,000 per person per year.
Right.
Keytruda, in cancer drugs, historically, drugs are approved for certain types of cancer. Breast cancer, ovarian cancer, lung cancer. But Keytruda, it targets PDL1 that is present in many different types of cancers.
Right.
So what companies like to pursue is a strategy in which they will rely upon metadata, data from ongoing clinical trials. An oncology doctor will say, this works really great for ovarian cancer, but I've also seen that it shrunk lung cancers in the same patient. So companies will use this data to get additional approvals to go from one cancer to another, and that gives rise to these patent term extensions.
Okay, now let me switch a little more to the, there's a question about what does a healthy US API base look like technically and economically, and if we can only prioritize a short list first, which criteria, clinical criticality, shortage history, single source risk should drive the picks?
Oh my goodness. Forgive me because we're old friends. I can bring this up. 40 years ago, you and I were sitting late one evening and you were discussing Adam Smith, the famous English economist, right? So the economists tell us that it's multilateralism. International trade is good for the world. Things move more efficiently that way. But we've also discovered that shortages and disruptions in the supply chain can occur for whatever reasons. A global pandemic, tariffs, whatever. Now, when that happens, though, countries are discovering that they can be engaged in supply chain disruption. So, for instance, in the United States, people died because they were relying upon supplies from the outside, 100% dependent upon imports for drugs that were adjuncts to surgery for use in hospitals. And in those sorts of circumstances, countries would like to have some sort of supply chain support so that they can survive through those potential disruptions. I spent some time, for instance, sourcing an unapproved drug, succinylcholine, for intubation for a series of hospitals in Paris, buying it from unapproved non-GMP sources in Latvia.
Right.
It shows how desperate countries can become. But when the flow of materials goes from China to India to the United States and to other countries, if China is securing its borders because they have such a desperate need through COVID-19, then some provisions have to be made to secure the supply chain when there are potential disruptions. And frankly, disruptions, they are a huge risk for all of us. Let me just use beta-lactam antibiotics as an example.
Yes.
Penicillins and cephalosporins. They're the fundamental bastion of anti-infectives for things like pneumonia, cough and cold, pediatric indications, amoxicillin and augmentin, right?
Yeah.
These are available. It's available throughout the world. More than 95% of the world's supply of those beta-lactam antibiotics originates from the fermentation of penicillin in China. If indeed, for whatever reason, China closed its borders for the export of beta-lactams, within 90 days, people in almost every country in the world would begin dying, because that's about how long the supply is of these fundamental anti-infective drugs. So the question is, how do you address these risks, and how important are these risks?
In continuation with that, now I would ask you a related question. Why did so much active ingredient manufacturing move to India and China? And which parts of the process are most concentrated there?
I'm going to bring up a little bit of an example from my prior history. Way back when, at Abbott Labs in the early 2000s in North Chicago, I worked in a facility, and across the parking lot from where my organization was a manufacturing plant for macrolide antibiotics. We fermented 8,000 metric tons a year of erythromycin in that plant. Well, there was such a drive for maximizing profit and return on investment, and to maximize the investment in bringing new drugs to the market, that in North Chicago, Illinois, they shut that facility down. We had 64,000 liter fermenters that were turning out erythromycin. Well, erythromycin, from there, the fermentation was transferred over to India. For a short period of time, it lived there. But then when the final patents began to expire, the Chinese had such an important, even though it was a minimal advantage in pricing, that now China ferments almost all of the world's supply of erythromycin again. It's not as black and white as all of the world's supply, but it's a good illustration of how it is. China has said, I wish to become an important purveyor of the building blocks for the world's supply of these goods. And they've done a very, very efficient job of it.
Right. Now, let me switch gears and let me focus on the US. Now, what is the idea behind the push to make 88 critical medicine ingredients, rather, in the US, and why focus on generic and OTC products? What is the reason for that?
You've sort of alluded to that already. The United States has looked through the experiences from supply chain disruptions through COVID and said, here's a critical list of 80 plus active pharmaceutical ingredients where we either do not make them in the United States or we make very little of what we need. And on the other hand, if we look at it orthogonally, those are very critical. If we don't have supply of those APIs, either we're not going to have a broad-based supply of things like paracetamol, or we're going to have hospitals who no longer have those critical medical adjuncts. Propofol, for instance, as one, an inhaled anesthetic, or lidocaine, otherwise known as xylocaine, not a very important API from the perspective of volume demand, and it's low priced, and you can get it from a lot of different sources globally. But if the US were isolated, we would have very little to no supply. So this is where this administration is now focusing and looking at reinstalling growing in some form or another through startups, through expanding the line. In the US, we have a very limited capacity to make our own APIs. India doesn't have that problem.
No.
You've got supplies of coal, you've got supplies of oil, petrochemicals. You can make your own APIs. We have coal and petrochemicals, but our fine chemicals industry doesn't make KSMs, and we don't make APIs. So I'll go on and I'll press. I'll guess at what your next question might be.
Right.
The U.S. probably has about less than 100 contract manufacturing organizations that make APIs. The U.S. FDA keeps track of this. Most of our API capacity is from big originator companies making sophisticated APIs for new drug discovery.
Right, absolutely.
We just don't have the capacity to make many large volume demand or many critical demand APIs. Fluticasone is another one, right? We used to have a huge supply of making steroids from plant-based soy sterols and fermentation. Again, that has moved to China.
China, yes.
No, we don't have U.S. supplies for those APIs. So nearshoring, friendshoring, collaborative ventures in the United States, these are all really of interest to be developing with India in order to protect the United States in case of supply outages.
One of the challenges today for any pharma company is the shortage and supply chain of APIs, intermediates, and drugs. And now with the advent of AI, how do you think AI could help in that direction?
Oh my goodness. My career has not been spent so much in pharmaceutical manufacturing, but I've begun to appreciate this working with many of the generic suppliers in India and China, and even in my own experience, because I used to supply these drugs for hospitals. Well, AI can really help with understanding the shape of the demand for your APIs. How much do you need? Where is the need concentrated? Is it seasonal? For instance, for malaria? Is it constant? For instance, for oncology? A company might be able to look at a demand for oncology drugs and say, well, I think I occupy a stable niche and I can make APIs in continuous flow manufacturing, and maybe I can even reduce the cost of manufacturing on that basis of having a constant picture of what my demand is.
Right.
But then there are others that are saying my demand is going to peak at certain seasons.
Absolutely.
During the monsoon. No?
Yeah.
And with others, this is my demand now, but how can I cope if I have a surge demand that's going to multiply fourfold or tenfold on the basis of some critical event? AI doesn't just help with scheduling, and it also helps with cleaning. One of the most astounding things I've seen is using AI in reducing the amount of solvent usage for boil-ups in cleaning validation.
Right.
So there are ways we don't appreciate that AI works wonders.
Now, I have a last few questions, Professor. There's a lot of talk about quality management, and we have with India a lot of quality is an issue especially with the Western market when Indians send their drugs and their products. So there is something called robust quality management for drug manufacturing. What does it mean in a day-to-day practice? I mean, how do you for an Indian company which always have a problem with that, how do you kind of explain that, and how does one do this in a day-to-day practice?
With your previous experience with Dr. Reddy's, I know that you've been really well exposed to this, and the framework behind it is this. We would love to look at the principles for quality management systems and good manufacturing practice and reduce it to a short list of things that we can just tick off the boxes and say, yes, I've got everything under control. But the ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization of Requirements, their quality modules have helped us look at this in a different perspective and have said, look at it from three different ways. One of them is, here's the general good manufacturing practice requirements. Here's what you need for validation, but validation is a continuous exercise.
Right.
As you continue to manufacture, you will have an enhanced understanding of what you're doing. And as you enhance that understanding, you can arrive at a set of key quality attributes that can be refined, and you can actually reduce over time your quality management burden burden in producing a product based on your enhanced understanding. And that's a simplified kind of an answer, but the whole idea of having an enhanced understanding of why your manufacturing process works the way it does enables you to identify as short a list as possible of what's really critical that affects the quality of the product, and to set limits on that so that you can not just improve your quality and reduce your defects, but also you can reduce the regulatory burden of assuring that quality.
So my last question, of course, we haven't touched upon the formulations, and I'm sure it's a very important area of pharmaceutical business. See, generally chemical formulations are everywhere. I'm talking about a generic questions to you. How do you think they impact our daily lives, from food additives to pharmaceuticals and beyond?
Wow. I'm going to start with just a simple example. Let's think about, say, paracetamol or ibuprofen, right? And I'll answer the question first from a business perspective. So from a business perspective, right, ibuprofen and paracetamol were launched as solid oral tablets. But over the years, what's happened is that we have grown in our understanding of basic formulation science, and now they've been reformulated to be better for us and for the rest of the world. In terms of, if you look through import-export data, you can find that even in the US, we can manage to make and export ibuprofen, but we export API for solid oral dosage forms like tablets. We export pre-granulated material so that a company in Ghana, for instance, can just do compression and coating, and the product is there. It's a convenience factor, and it helps them, but it also helps the supplier because you can charge more for something that's already granulated. And then there's also material that's in the form of a gel that's for encapsulation, which improves the onset of action and provides a lot of convenience for the patient. And so it not only provides good things for people, but it also provides a better business. So a company that might not otherwise be in paracetamol is saying, when I go from the API to the finished product, I'm getting about a 6 or 7-fold increase in the price that I can charge. And that means that I can afford to sell this product.
Great. Now, my last question is, you have done some remarkable work in Africa with Dr. Yusuf Hamid in Cipla. I would like to sort of tell us about how it was done and what role you played, and how Yusuf Hamid was so forthcoming in providing $1 drug for HIV in those geographies.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to actually repeat to you a little bit of the story as relayed by Dr. Hamid himself, who I spoke to a few days ago. Way back in 2004, the world was totally concerned about being submerged in a giant wave of us dying from HIV. And we knew that the drugs that were available were effective, but they were very expensive. And there was a huge need to provide those drugs for lowest income countries. The Global Fund and the World Health Organization got together, and the U.S. President's Emergency Fund emerged as ways of funding making those drugs available. At the same time, the originator pharmaceutical companies didn't quite realize anywhere near how good India was as a provider. And they campaigned for making those drugs purchased from big pharmaceutical companies, from the GlaxoSmithKlines of the world. And Yusuf Hamid stood up and said, look, what I've done is I've combined 3 HIV drugs together. One of them is under patent with Bristol Myers Squibb, one is with Boehringer Ingelheim, and one is with GlaxoSmithKline. When you combine those 3 drugs together, that's the best triple combination that we have. You can't even sell that in the United States because that combination's not allowed. And I've been pre-inspected and approved by the FDA to assure my quality. And because I do this in India, with Indian innovation, Indian processes, and Indian manufacturing costs, I can supply this for $1 a day. Now, frankly, India is going to do this before long to end HIV. But India is also the driver of increasing life expectancy across much of the rest of the world in terms of all of the other non-communicable diseases that we've been speaking speaking of, returning all the way back to the beginning of our conversation,
Yeah.
let's think about diabetes. Let's think about cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis and oncology. That's how we can get there. And I think that there should be ways of doing this, but it's going to take that Indian innovation again. This is where I think you have a huge opportunity. But again, we need to find ways of doing this in such a way that it's legal. And the other thing is that you need to make a healthy profit at this.
Thank you.
So Professor Javed, I'd like to give you one example of how Indian innovation has really driven saving lives in the rest of the world. And it relates to a drug that used to be very important for HIV called efavirenz. I was privileged to help launch this drug in 1997 in the United States. It became part of a triple combination that was a backbone of treatment of up to 20 million people every day for quite a number of years. Now, in the United States, we used a certain process to make that active pharmaceutical ingredient, and that was the limiting factor in the cost of therapy. An Indian generic company working with chemistry that we had initiated but never carried full through the development process in the United States, and also with Professor David Collum at Cornell University, came up with a very elegant synthesis that helped reduce the cost of the API. So as a frame of reference, when the drug was launched as a generic, the API cost over $700 a kilo. When the API was manufactured finally by the Indian generic company using this ultimately excellent new route of synthesis, it was less than $100 a kilo. It was about $85 a kilo. So less than, about 1/8 of what it used to be. And this truly did help drive the availability of that triple combination for the rest of the world, saving many, many, many lives.
Brilliant. That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm very glad you mentioned about it because we completely overlooked this kind of thing. So, Professor, it has been an exciting and a very invigorating discussion. And thank you very much for your time and some wisdom.
Thank you so much.